You're listening to Biotech Hangout, a live and unedited weekly discussion of all the latest news in our industry with a group of biotech leaders and experts. I'm Chris Garabedian, and my co-hosts today are Brian Skorney, Graig Suvannavejh, and our special guest, the co-founder and CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks, Jason Kelly. And really glad to have you. For more information about our hosts and guest speakers, or to listen to the most recent episode, please go to biotechhangout.com. So first, we always like to touch on kind of market overview. I'll just mention we saw another IPO filing, Kardigan. This was following last week's Parabolis uh, uh, IPO. And Kardigan is the latest filing. It's about the 11th biotech filing this year, already beating or matching the total number that we saw in 2025. Kardigan is led by the former CEO and management team of Myocardia. So Tassos Giannakakis is the CEO. He brought on his former CMO and CSO from Myocardia, which was acquired by BMS for 13 billion. So they've acquired several clinical stage products. They have three unique products with different mechanisms in phase 2B studies, going after genetic cardiomyopathy and severe hypertension and aortic valve atherosclerosis, et cetera. So they've got a late stage pipeline, and again, they've raised more than $500 million in their Series A and Series B just in less than the last 18 months. And so going public, this will be one of those record-setting amounts raised for and tracked to IPO. Within 18 months that we've seen. So, again, I think we're all watching. So far, the IPOs have held pretty well. And just wanted to, ask Greg and Brian, as we sit here about to enter June, the 6th month of the year, 11 IPOs. How are you guys reading this in terms of we were all looking at the beginning of the year with an eye toward IPOs as a marker of how healthy the current states of biotech are. How do you guys see it where we are today at the end of May?
I'll jump in first, and Greg, feel free to correct me with your thoughts. Look, I mean, I think it's good. Certainly, capital markets is a big driver. Right? These companies all consume a lot of cash, so being able to raise at decent valuations, raise a lot of money, have an IPO window open, that kind of makes everyone happy, right? I think IPOs, and as things move earlier and earlier, right, that's also somewhat of a signal of moving into bubble territory. I don't really think it's there yet, but there's certainly been an acceleration. I think earlier in the year, maybe January, we talked about this a lot. I think on one of these with Matisse and Shimmer and I think Shimmer said he was looking at like 50 plus IPOs. I think I don't remember exactly what Matisse's number was. I think it was maybe like 13. I said I was sort of in the middle.
It was 15. I remember being on that. He was
15. All right. So unless things go really south, Paul's going to wind up undershooting that number. Yeah. So we'll have to see. I think it's healthy. I think the follow-ons have looked really healthy, right? I mean, strong companies with strong data have done really well and been able to trade up. I think capital markets overall looks healthy for biotech. I get the question of like, is it past healthy? Are we getting past the point where too many companies are raising too much money? And we all remember. I mean, everyone's been in this game long enough to kind of remember 2000 and the peaks of COVID, and the kind of dearth of IPOs that followed as the market kind of cratered after that. But I don't think we're anywhere near that, right? I mean, this is not a frothy biotech market to any extent.
I'll just say, Brian, my comment is I think this collection of IPOs is a little bit different, later stage, clinical. We see companies that have had clinical data, like Avalyn, that have gone out. And so, if this was a preclinical, right, we have ideas to have a bunch of drugs that are moving into the clinic with a great management team that has a proven track record like Kardigan does, I'd be much more worried than having 3 phase 2B, shots on goal. Makes it a little, I guess, less frothy in my opinion. Let me just continue with Endpoints does these quarterly Biopharma Sentiment Indexes, And it's kind of a nice way to just track where things are going with different stakeholders. And they just released one this past week, and the overall index, so 100 kind of being the standard average, the overall index moved from 78 across all stakeholders in fourth quarter of 25 to 90 in first quarter of 26 to 96 in second quarter of 26, this latest survey. But again, that is an average among various stakeholders. And so when they cut it by investors and the finance group, they have a finance investment, and then they have different levels within that. But they basically moved pretty considerably from Q1 to Q2. The business conditions currently moved 50 points to 120 over the index. The overall average among finance investment went to 120, even though the overall average was 96. So it seems that the investment community and the finance are definitely feeling more bullish in this second quarter. They rate subcategories like business conditions, I mentioned, moved 50 points. Funding climate moved 54 points. They also look at the 12-month outlook, and that moved 26 points. And regulatory environment over the next 12 months. And now it's not clear if this was surveyed before and or after Makary's departure. I think the survey might have gone out before Makary's departure, and they might have collected more after. But that moved 53 points in terms of expectations of the regulatory policy environment. So whether that would have gone down, knowing that the commissioner left, or if it went up, maybe because he did leave, I don't know. But anyway, the overall sentiment is shifting across all stakeholders, including CEOs, biotech CEOs, CROs, and CDMOs. They poll. Those are still tracking below the 100 index, but are all moving in the right direction. So overall, things are looking pretty positive. And again, on the venture side, we're still seeing good deal flow on the private side. So we wanted to move to our special guest. Jason Kelly, who I mentioned at the top of the hour, co-founder and CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks. He's been speaking about the China issue. China's been a main topic for our industry now, at least for the last year to 2 years, in terms of the reliance of pharma and biotech increasingly to access drugs in China. And this has sparked quite a debate on social media. Peter Kolchinsky, Tess Cameron from RA Capital put a kind of a white paper out in kind of an anti-protectionist stance. And Jason, I wanted to thank you for coming on and kind of speaking about your position. I will mention, and I just want to ask about this. So besides being co-founder and CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks, your own profile on the website says you served as chair of the U.S. National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, which oversees how advancements in emerging biotechnology will shape current and future activities of the U.S. Department of Defense. And so, just trying to understand how much that has colored your lens. Maybe if there are things that you have insight on about China and the threat of biotech working with China, would love to understand that better, because you have a unique vantage point having served in that role. But also I want to kind of challenge the idea that we've been, quote, outsourcing for a long time now. I mean, chemistry to India and China, and so many of us view this as just a natural extension of what has gone on for decades in terms of outsourcing, globally, even going to Australia for a phase one. There's many different ways that we access other. But anyway, I wanted to set that up for our audience. But yeah, what's your perspective on it all?
Yeah, and I think like all that complexity just in sort of the supply chain that goes into both the discovery of a drug, the clinical trials associated with a drug, the ultimate then manufacturing and commercialization of the drug, it's very complicated, right? Which is why it makes this like a pretty tricky topic to talk about. So I will try to like drill down on what I'm specifically worried about. And it is informed by my experience with the NSCDB, right? So I chaired that for 2 years, and then now Senator Young is the chair of that commission. And like, just to give like a little bit of background, there's a commission like this now, I guess 6 or 7 years ago, that Eric Schmidt was the chair of, that was focused on AI.
Yep.
And then one before that, like way back in the day, on like cyber, right? And so the idea is, hey, there are these strategic technologies that matter ultimately to national security, and we want to make sure that the U.S. is like the leader in those technologies. Right? We don't have to be the only place that does them, but we want to make sure the frontier is happening here, right? And you can kind of feel this viscerally, like if Anthropic and OpenAI and all of that energy was happening in China right now, and we were sort of here in the U.S. deciding if we wanted to use a Chinese model, like that, like to me, like the power of that technology, regardless, like we know that one is going to be deployed for military purposes, both for economic and national security military reasons. I certainly feel a lot better that technology is centered here in the United States.
Yep.
Okay. And so I think we have this question, which is, how do we feel about biotechnology, right? And what's weird about biotech, and again, this is a call very much focused on the therapeutics industry, but I think part of the reason I was invited to be the chair of that commission was we had actually done a lot of work at Ginkgo over the years in industrial biotechnology. So this is the development of enzymes and things like that for production of chemicals, also in agricultural biotechnology, and we did work in therapeutics. And so we kind of cross-cut. And what I would say is I believe we're very much at the infancy of biotech, right? It's sort of like if you rewound the clock on computers, yeah, we look at computers today, but they were really invented sort of in like the 40s and 50s. And then IBM kind of got them off the ground in the 60s and 70s in a big way with mainframes. And then we all noticed them as consumers in the 1980s and 90s when they were like fully 60 years into sort of like computation moving to machines.
Sure.
Right. And, genetic engineering really began in 1978 and Genentech in the early 80s, Monsanto in the 90s, and so here we are kind of like 40 years into our journey. All right. So it's still early and we're still seeing what are the first uses of this technology. But to me, the engineering of a cell, the designing of DNA, this is our other sort of programmable substrate alongside computers. And we should not assume the only use of this technology is to make protein therapeutics.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Like that feels really short-sighted.
Yeah.
About genetic engineering.
Yeah. And
considering
let me
all of our food is made with genetic engineering, the atmosphere, is made with biology. The atmosphere is produced by biology. Our human bodies are made out of biology. Like the idea that genetic engineering and biotechnology is just therapeutics in terms of what it could be used for is to me, is naive, or people are just saying that because they have other motivations. To me, ultimately, it is very clearly a technology that has dual use. It's very clearly a strategic technology. We experienced with COVID that, a single RNA virus can shut whole countries down, right? Like we cannot be, I think it's time for the biotech industry to grow up a little bit and appreciate that this technology has great potential and great power, and thus it is strategic, and countries will treat it that way. And so my experience with the NSCB was just looking and noticing quite how strategic China was being about it. And so, but I'll pause there for a second.
Yeah,
Before I dive into drugs, what has got me on about this is I watch the weird thing about genetic engineering today is that 90% of the market for cell engineering is basically therapeutics.
Yeah.
It's proteins, it's cell therapies, it's gene therapies, it's RNA, right? But that whole line of designing nucleic acids and having the talent and the technology base, it all sits downstream of basically one app area at the moment. And so whoever controls that application area ultimately controls genetic engineering. It's a little bit like controlling computers in the 60s and 70s. And what's woken me up is I'm watching us offshore that to China, and I'm watching us actively, U.S. investors, U.S. pharmaceutical companies supporting the offshoring of what I consider to be strategic technology that will ultimately be more important than computers.
Yeah. So let me.
I'm just not going to sit down and watch it happen. So I'll pause.
Yeah. Let me just provide a different counter. So look, I think it's a healthy debate, especially as you look at longer term, I'll call more existential kind of meta narratives around technology and who will kind of control that and own that. But the real issue is, and the reason this was elevated recently was the idea of the Coins Act, which depending your interpretation and the reading of it, and I'm not an expert in the legislation, but it's really going to be curtailing this activity of licensing drugs and really finding opportunities to advance and accelerate human therapeutics for real disease applications. When I was a public company CEO, I was partnering with the Department of Defense. This was what became Sarepta, called AVI Biopharma, and we were definitely working on medical countermeasures and bioterror threats and all of that. So definitely there's a place for that to understand how to protect our country from misuse or using those technologies against us and the people of the United States. But in the cases that I think are being brought up, it really is about why curtail our ability, where we, most would argue the US is best practice in terms of drug development and the ability to take something that, might be found preclinically, wherever it may come from, or designing a drug de novo and working with an India supplier or a China supplier, taking the next step of, all right, let's see a well-characterized asset, or even one that has even entered the clinic in China is even more well-characterized before it's brought over, right? And having have to do the clinical trials, the pivotal studies, that makes it a real therapeutic. And so the idea is that aren't we really just arguing over the next incremental step of outsourcing that the industry's come to rely upon? And then I'll just add that I didn't read the entire detailed white paper, but RA came up with this idea of Eurowashing, which is the idea that you're incorporating unintended circumstances where, just like when we were offshoring to Ireland and domiciling there for tax benefits,
Yep.
and are you going to see the same thing happening? Because we can have European or multinationals, and we already see this with deals with China, with GSK, a UK based company, but BMS, and even today Pfizer, right?
Yep.
Another announcement
Yep.
of China. So I don't think we're going to be able to put the toothpaste back in the tube. And aren't we just hurting the US by trying to restrict us from being able to have that free market capacity?
Yeah, so sort of two questions embedded in there, and
Yep.
I'll get to both. Um, and maybe I'll go quickly through the first one. We can circle back on, get to the second point you just
Yep.
brought up. On the first one, I think from my perspective, again, sort of what I just said, I think it is a bit simplistic to say that whoever that this is just about the therapeutic uses of this technology. I think it is about a industrial capability in the area of biotechnology. And it's fine if it's, hey, other places are going to have it. All I insist is that the US is the frontier. And I don't agree with you that we are assured that. I think we are in the process of offshoring the innovation engine of biotechnology right now. And you see this reflected. I'm here in Massachusetts, right? For the first time since MassBio has tracked it, we saw a decrease of 1,100 R&D jobs in 2024, right? These are like US scientists who cannot get work anymore in the biopharma industry because that work is now happening in China. These are discovery scientists. These are the people who lead the frontier, okay? We have 1/3 of our lab space here in the Massachusetts area empty right now. This is not cyclical in my opinion. This is a consequence of an offshoring. Okay, so that's sort of, and we can talk more about that. But my point number one is I do think what we're starting to lose here is not I'm handing off to a chemist to make a molecule that was designed here, in the United States, but rather I'm actually just moving the science of genetic engineering offshore. Okay, and then to your second point, yes, Peter, I think that the article is long enough. It's convincing, but the Eurowashing thing I don't think makes any sense. And the basic reason is that if you look at the market for drugs, it is not a free market. Okay, and you can tell because 70% of the profits for therapeutics originate with U.S. consumers who make up 4% of the world's population. Right.
But
So
aren't you
we're not
making?
operating
Yeah.
in a free market environment here at all. And so then the question is just, what do we want to do about that? We could go to a scenario where we spread the cost of R&D across a wider set of countries, or we could say, hey, the cost. If you want to have the national security and strategic value of a biotechnology industry with high quality scientist jobs and moving the frontier of technology, if you want that, and by the way, I think it's real valuable to have that, as I already said at the beginning, well, then you better have a domestic therapeutics industry to support it.
Yeah,
If
I'm
you're not
sorry,
willing to
Jason, though,
pony up
but
for
why is
that,
it?
you don't get the industry. But what we're doing right now
Yeah.
is we are paying for all the R&D that is going to be creating a capability in China, even though the US voter and the US consumer is the one paying for everything. And that there is no euro washing. That's like a nonsense term that just got made up. The US can obviously block whatever it wants. We can control our market. And we are, in this case, uniquely. So, like, unlike, say, cars or electronics or software, where there's a large ex-US market, quite simply, we are the market for drugs. So the rules we set, I do not believe that you'll see some magical merger of like Europe and China, because who will they sell to?
Yeah, but Jason, I'm sorry. It sounds like your argument of the U.S. being the beneficiary of the profits, right? Which Peter's talked
Sorry,
largely
no, not
about.
you're misconstruing. Not the beneficiary of the profit. So, or go ahead, finish your comment. Yeah,
No,
sorry.
but you just said 75% of the profit that's made is in the U.S.
I'm saying it is no. The buying, like, who is buying the drugs? Like there's a certain amount of
I know, but
like
how does
revenue
China
flow.
benefit from that when we're talking about multinationals who sell these drugs, or even U.S. biotechs that are able to, even if they license the drug from China, if they commercialize that and are hugely successful, yeah, China might have a small equity position that gets diluted over time, but I'm not clear on how that's benefiting China if we license a drug from China, successfully commercialize it, right? Pay the R&D, but become the beneficiary of the revenues and profits disproportionately, right, to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and again, I'll focus back on what I said at the beginning.
Yeah.
The thing I consider to be national security relevant is who has the capability to do the frontier of biotechnology.
But
And
are you talking like new tools and new technologies that are emerging? Let's call it like as when CRISPR and base editing
yep,
evolved. Are because
absolutely.
all
Yep,
right,
that
all
kind
right,
of stuff. Yeah, 100%. Yep,
okay,
all those
so
types of things. DNA synthesis, whatever it might be. There's new
yeah.
technologies all the time.
And I
Right?
just
Yeah.
think that's a narrow view. And part of the controversy around here is the Coins Act seems to be wanting to overreach and make it very overly restrictive, because I would argue that, like, drug discovery, like, we know already that 99+% of drugs that look good in a rodent model never make it to approval. Okay. So this is a industry that lives with failure, and 90% plus, the latest data when Atlas did their annual review was 97% don't make it to FDA approval for products that are entering into the clinic. So this is not a game that's going to be easy. And I think the argument is that, like, we need to figure out and access wherever those technologies might be coming from. I understand your idea about like biodefense and existential threats over that. But if we're talking about trying to just develop a technology for a unmet need disease, and that's why I brought up the human therapeutics, I don't see how having it overly restrictive of being able to license an antibody from a China company, right, is a problem. I'll be honest, I've spoken about this. I think the bigger risk is that pharma bypasses US biotech and goes straight to China to do the deals that GSK's done with Hengro and BMS has done and Pfizer's doing with Innovent. Like, that is a bigger threat where they don't need US biotech. They don't need the financing behind that. They'll just go
Yeah,
direct.
sure,
And I,
sorry. That is exactly what I'm talking about. Yes.
yeah, well, all right, but that's different than the biotech industry, right? And the idea
Right.
that, biotech can thrive. And actually, I mean, I would argue that Ginkgo, again, just reading your website, I don't know your business model like, fully, but like autonomous labs, I mean, you speak about
Yeah.
like
You can think of us
protecting
like Thermo
jobs.
with robots. That's the easiest
Yeah,
way
yeah,
to think about it.
but still, I mean, are if you're worried about US jobs, isn't Ginkgo contributing to eliminating jobs, which I don't think is bad. I think we need to get more
No,
efficient.
we're not actually. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so I'll speak to a couple of things, but
Okay,
let's
so autonomous labs is not going to eliminate jobs, human
no,
jobs.
yeah. So, like, for example, there's a great ad. I'll post it on Twitter after this, from 1952 IBM ad, and it talks about the IBM mechanical calculator. And there's this great picture of this like refrigerator-sized electronics device. And it says, does the work of 150 extra engineers. And it shows 150, all men, of course, holding slide rules. Okay, 150 of these engineers. And you might have imagined that the IBM electronic calculator would be bad for engineer jobs, considering they'd be out of work moving the slide rules. Now, of course, that's the opposite of what happened.
Yeah, no,
as we made the
Yeah.
ROI on the what was in the heads of those engineers more valuable because we made the work no longer manual.
Yeah, I
We actually
understand the debate that
exploded the
AI will
number
create more
of,
jobs.
jobs
Yeah.
for engineers. And so I think the only way in the long run that we are able to, because I do agree, like no one fights about that we should make U.S. R&D more efficient. No one fights that we should make our clinical trials more efficient. Everyone's just getting upset when I talk about things we should do to slow down China. So this is a thing in the bucket of making us more efficient, and no, I think it would expand the number of jobs just like it did in the
Yeah.
science.
Generally, and I think that
we can move to
it. No. And Jason, no, I appreciate it because I think the reason we wanted to have you on was to allow you to articulate your view, more, precisely, right? And there's Nicholas Tillmans was also representing more of that the view you're describing online, so people can check that out, his X threads and posts. And read Peter Kolchinsky's to have a better nuance of this. I think at the end of the day, the argument, as I see it, is that when you start to impose specific controls and incentives and disincentives, it does invite unintended consequences. And oftentimes those are actually worse than the original intent. And so,
and again, I really think it's not appreciating how unique it is that and this is the thing I want to not lose here.
Yeah.
The reason I'm bringing up the 70% of the profits is not about that the U.S. companies make that money. It's that the U.S. consumer pays that.
Yep.
The U.S. voter pays for the profits of the drug industry, period. And so if the U.S. voter wants to have this industry operate in a certain way because it's in our national security interest in the country, or it's good for jobs for the U.S. voter, or whatever it might be, boy, can they decide that. And there isn't some weaselly way to get around that. When you are 70% of the market, you can set the rules.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about Medicaid, Medicare, and the payment there. You've got a lot of private pay. You've got like the investors are the ones putting the capital at risk to try to benefit. And look, we're all agreeing that we need Europe and other countries to pay their fair share, and that we've been carrying the brunt of the profitability of this industry. Otherwise, it's going to go away completely, and I think it hurts the entire industry. But this has been helpful. Let me just invite our other co-hosts if there's any other questions or comments for Jason, Greg, or Brian, or anything that I missed in terms of a commentary on this topic.
No, that was great. I'm just listening with fascination myself.
Same.
Great. Well, look, Jason, I think
cool. I appreciate you giving me the time. Yeah, it was fun to chat.
Yeah, and I know we had to go, and that's why we covered this topic first. Jason, appreciate your time. I know you've got to run at the half hour, and we've got a lot more to cover here. So thanks.
And by the way, I appreciate you guys doing this. Not like in general, the Biotech Hangout. Like I'll put in a plug that more people should be listening. I listen to it frequently. So I just think we need more people talking about our industry on social media and things like this. So I'm glad you
got it. All right, Jason, thanks so much for joining. Okay, so let's move. Again, hopefully the audience enjoyed that because it has been a kind of a raging back and forth on social media. But again, I mentioned the Pfizer deal. Again, this is just another continuation of China. I'll also mention that WuXi announced a deal with Viridian, a biotech company, for a manufacturing deal. WuXi also announced that they grew in 2025. Their numbers grew despite concerns about the Biosecure Act. So there's still a lot of biotechs that are outsourcing to China. That doesn't seem to be going away. And I think we'll have to see what ultimately happens with the Coins Act and the final provisions or anything around that. But anyway, it's something. But anyway, Greg or Brian, do you want to cover just the Pfizer? Any further comments on that? Again, follows the BMS deal with Hengrui. These are biodollar deals, so this was only $650 million up front. But I don't know. Do you guys have any different perspectives on the whole, licensing from China, whether it's pharma or biotech. Or not. So, all right. Let's move to a Lilly deal. Again, Lilly has been bolstering the M&A numbers for 2026. Very active. In this case, they bought 3 vaccine companies announced in one day for up to, and again, these are biodollar with milestones, but up to 3.8 billion. And very specifically, they bought Curvo for up to 1.5 billion for a shingles vaccine. They bought the vaccine company. It's called Vaccine Company for an Epstein-Barr vaccine for another 1.55 billion, and they also bought Limitech for a Staph aureus vaccine that is really used to prevent kind of hospital-based infections associated with surgery for 780 million. Notably, Lilly hired Peter Marks, who is the FDA official in charge of vaccine approvals. We talk a lot about migration from FDA to industry, but presumably he shared his expertise about vaccines and vaccine approvals. So it seems like Lilly's solidly in the vaccine business with these three acquisitions. Let's see, Brian. Why don't we go to some of the antiviral stuff? I know you've covered Gilead for a long time. Do you want to cover the HBV data that came out that kind of had some of the best functional cure rates that we've seen, and then Biohaven R&D Day?
Yeah,
Are
sure.
you good to cover that?
Yeah, of course. So hepatitis B has been a funny disease area. I covered all the Hep C companies, and it was like this big change in standard of care that Pharmaset, well, first Vertex, then Pharmaset, then ultimately Gilead wound up being the big winner alongside of AbbVie, and for years. On the peak of that, people were looking to HBV as sort of like the next place to go from chronic or very low rates of cure to sort of a shorter oral therapy cure eventually, and that's sort of like always been the goal to get patients. Right now, patients with Hep B will be on antiviral therapy that just chronically suppresses them, and as long as they're on the therapy, you don't have the virus really inflaming the liver, causing liver damage. But ultimately, like in Hep C, we want people to just be cured, some short, easy to take regimen, and the virus goes away. And it has been a long, slow development path. And a number of companies have come and gone trying to do this. And Glaxo just the other day announced data from 2 phase 3 studies of their treatment, bepirovirsen, which is actually one of Ionis's old drugs, I believe. And it's an injectable targeted agent. They show not fantastic functional cure rates, but functional cure rates. In these studies, they got about a 19% functional cure rate. And a functional cure is when you both have undetectable levels of DNA and surface antigen in the blood for at least 6 months after all therapy is stopped, right? So this is actually a very, very long treatment course. So patients will stop all treatment after 48 weeks if they meet a specific secondary endpoint. And of those patients, about 19% were able to maintain those markers without seeing a relapse. Now, this is arguably better than what we've seen. There is data in publications to kind of indicate that like pegylated interferon combination therapy with the Viriad can maybe drive 5-10% functional cure rates after very, very long time. So I haven't heard people particularly enthusiastic about this, but I wonder if it brings back interest into the Hep B realm once again, knowing and seeing that we can maybe push the functional cure rates up higher, and as we evolve scientifically, maybe we'll get to that point that we were hoping for 10 years ago on the peak of Hep C to be replicated shortly thereafter with Hep B. It's not the case, but science, often moves a lot slower than we anticipate.
Well, and I'm dating myself, but I remember like cccDNA was the really hard, hard to crack that code. And like, have they just figured out mechanistically how to generate that more sustained, right, S antigen, right? Like, clearance and just I don't know. Because I know it was very, very hard, much harder than in HCV. And so is that kind of what we're seeing. Obviously, it creates the unmet need. And then maybe just speak a little bit, the HDV approval that Gilead got, this was a subset. You have to have HBV in order to have the HDV, which is a more severe phenotype. Maybe you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, this isn't specifically targeted to cccDNA, but the presence of cccDNA and sort of its latency within hepatocytes is thought to be one of the the primary reasons why you see relapse of hepatitis B, and you never quite get a cure rate, that it's just kind of sitting around in those hepatocytes and not subject to viral inhibition or
Clearance.
viral clearance. So you get rid of the HBV, but eventually the cccDNA can produce HBV virus, and you wind up with a rebound. So this isn't targeted to cccDNA directly. That's been a very, very hard nut to crack. This is targeted to inhibiting a number of the RNA components of the hepatitis B virus. It's an antisense oligonucleotide, and I think the mechanism of how exactly very, very long suppressive inhibition of parts of the virus, components of the virus, ultimately leads to functional cure. People believe maybe there's an immunomodulatory approach. Maybe if you just keep it sustainably down long enough, the hepatocytes with cccDNA ultimately turn over, and the cccDNA is not there to source virus anymore. Whatever it is, it seems like if you really throw the kitchen sink at this virus for a long time, some patients will wind up with functional cures. But yeah, I think we have a long way to go and a lot more to understand about sort of the latency of the virus and how to really kind of turn that over. So HDV, so Gilead got accelerated approval of Hepcludex, and this is a product that they bought in an acquisition a number of years ago. They wound up getting approval in Europe, and it was approved in Europe. And Hep D is, I think, also a very, very interesting virus. It basically lives off of S antigen, so it's a prerequisite to have hepatitis B to effectively have infection with Hep Delta, and it is these patients are very severe. It's a Hep B. The virus is kind of slow. It can take a decade, even untreated, to really lead to liver impairment, liver failure. Patients with that co-infection of Hep B progress very rapidly. So there's definitely a significant need for Hep Delta treatments. This is the first treatment for chronic HDV infection. The data is okay. I think there's a number of companies that have been working on products to substantially improve upon this. I actually follow one of these companies in Mirum Pharmaceuticals, where they're targeting S antigen specifically to basically prevent HDV from utilizing and binding to S antigen to ultimately see viral replication. This has been a long time coming in the approval. Gilead doesn't break out Hepcludex sales in Europe right now, so it's not a very big drug. I don't think there's high expectations that Hepcludex is going to be a big driver for Gilead. But I think it's a very severe disease, and I think even though it's mostly in third world countries, I think you see a lot of pricing power here.
Yeah, and continues to just create their strong foothold on the antiviral space and hepatitis. So Greg, are you back with us? I want to make sure we test out your voice.
Yeah, can you hear me
Yeah,
okay
you
now?
sound great. Great to hear
Okay,
you.
yeah,
All right,
so sorry about that.
no worries. Now, you were going to touch on the Apogee Blackstone, and then you've got a lot of cancer update to cover. We might have to go a little more rapid fire, but why don't you go ahead and start?
Yeah, so again, apologies to the audience for my technical issues, but yeah, Apogee reported some very positive top line phase 2 data earlier this week for its lead asset, which is called Kybart, if I'm saying that correctly. It's an antibody for atopic dermatitis. The data were positive, although there was some debate as to what they saw with the dose response, where the high dose did not work as well as the middle dose. But in any case, they are moving forward and that program into phase 3. And what's really interesting here is that while most of us assume that the standard playbook for a biotech is that you raise capital via, post good data via a follow-on equity-based financing. Instead, concurrent with the data released, Apogee announced a financing with the folks at Blackstone Life Sciences and what looks to be a pretty creative deal structure. So there's up to 1.3 billion available in a non-dilutive deal, with 800 million available in what's being called a synthetic royalty financing, and another 500 million available as a more traditional senior debt offering that can be, elected to be used at a time in the future when both parties agree. So, very interesting structure. We've seen Blackstone, become more active in this space. Certainly, we've seen Royalty Pharma get involved, but I think most of us thought that, on good data, there'd be a big capital raise and all the banks would be jockeying for seeing who could get on the deal. But instead, I guess no banks got paid, and Blackstone came in and provided the financing. So very creative structure there.
Great. And just a new player, I guess, if they got comfortable around another royalty buyout, maybe we'll see more coming out of Blackstone on that. Because they just did close a large fund again this year. So they've got a lot of fresh powder.
Yeah. And then with that, maybe I'll go into a bit of an ASCO preview. So
Yep.
part of my technical issues is I just landed in Chicago about 2 hours ago and hoofed it over to my hotel to be able to do this podcast. And so again, apologies for my technical issues. But let's talk about ASCO. So as most of we all know, ASCO. The annual ASCO Cancer Conference, which takes place in Chicago, it officially kicks off today, and ASCO is the largest cancer conference in the world. An estimated, 35 to 45,000 people from all over the world attending. There are doctors, cancer care providers, and cancer caregivers, researchers, and of course, pharma and biotech that are here to present their latest data, hear the latest and greatest that's happening in the oncology space. And there's also a small army of folks from the investment community, like myself, who will be attending as well. So, with that said, I think as we think about ASCO this year from an investment community perspective, I think it's relatively light this year in terms of the major data sets that we think could really move stocks. But that being said, I still think there's still so much to be excited about at ASCO this year. I decided to make the trip, obviously, with some really great advances in the field and innovations that will be presented. With so much going on over the next 5 days, it's really hard to capture all that will take place. But with that said, I think some of the key technologies and asset classes that have been really gaining traction and the attention of investors would be things like bispecific antibodies, antibody drug conjugates, cell therapies like CAR T, which have had great success in the hematology oncology space, but trying to um, make their way into solid tumors. And then there's this class of drugs that's called the RAS inhibitors. And, we've probably spoken about the RAS inhibitors a lot over these past several podcasts. But the plenary sessions take place on Sunday. And there are a couple of presentations that I think a lot of people will want to, listen and hear. And speaking about the RAS inhibitors, Revolution Medicines, which has a drug for pancreatic cancer called daraxonrasib. They will be presenting the results of their phase 3 Resolute 302 study. And recall back in April, the company announced second line data where patients who received daraxonrasib, again, in a second line setting, they were able to achieve a median overall survival of 13.2 months, and that compares with 6.7 months for standard chemotherapy. So you're talking about practically a doubling of the survival benefit. But that was just top lined. So on Sunday here at ASCO, we'll get more details from that phase 3 Resolute 302 study. Importantly, we'll all be looking at the overall survival data on a patient by patient basis, progression-free survival, duration of response, duration of treatment, and notably safety, tolerability, and adverse events. I'm sure some of you on the podcast may have seen the New York Times video-based interview with former Senator Ben Sasse, who unfortunately has late-stage pancreatic cancer. He very brave in coming out and to show everyone how he's living with his disease. But he's being treated with daraxonrasib and doing relatively well. But that being said, rash that some of you may have seen, particularly on his face, is something that's undesirable. So, with that said, we are going to try to get more of a view on the overall safety tolerability of daraxonrasib. They are going to be sharing data at some point later this year, I think, in a first line setting. But these RAS inhibitors are really exciting. There's several companies right behind Revolution Medicines that are working on other flavors of RAS inhibitors, and some of these companies, and it's not meant to be an exclusive list or an exhaustive list, but this includes Araska that at Mizuho we cover, and also Veristem, which is a company that I cover. These are earlier stage, but clearly Revolution Medicines with their pan-RAS inhibitor has set an impressive efficacy bar. That said, we've also, I think right after that, we're going to have data from Summit Therapeutics. Summit in-licensed PD-1 VEGF bispecific from a Chinese company. And so, very topical. They are presenting study data from a Chinese study that's late stage. It's called the Harmony 6 study, if I've got that correctly. But we'll be very interested in seeing like how that data evolve. And I think a lot of excitement amongst investors has been about the potential of this PD-1 VEGF bispecific being perhaps a better Keytruda-like drug. And remember, last year, Keytruda generated some $32.5 billion in sales. So that all eyes will be certainly on that plenary session. In my own coverage universe, we've got 3 companies in particular that will have interesting data. One that I'll mention is called Corbus Pharmaceuticals. They're advancing a Nectin-4 targeting antibody drug conjugate for several cancers, in particular treatment with their CRB701 drug was shown, and the company announced this data last week. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that led to a 43% response rate in patients with a certain type of head and neck cancer called oropharyngeal cancer. And that compares with like teens response rates that you see with current standard of care. So that's one company we'll be paying close attention to. Another smaller cap company is called Immuneering. They have a novel MEK pathway inhibitor. And with what we consider to be very tantalizing data in a first line pancreatic cancer setting, they just announced 17 months of median overall survival in patients. And depending on which chemotherapy-based standard of care, that is a more than doubling of what patients usually see. And then lastly, a company that I'll briefly mention, that company is called Amadix. Amadix has a presence in Germany, but they're Houston-based, and they are tackling PRAME, which is an antigen that is expressed in over 50 cancers. And Maddox has a broad portfolio of therapeutics to hopefully attack PRAME, which is highly expressed in melanoma. But I think ASCO is going to be very important for this company because not only will they show the power of their platform, but they have both cell therapies and bispecifics that can go after PRAME. And I think the key here at this conference is to also show that they can go beyond melanoma. So those are some of the companies that we're paying close attention to, but there is so much happening at ASCO, and hopefully that's just some high level snippets there.
Well, it sounds like you got a busy week ahead with as many companies you're covering. And I'm glad we got you back online. Otherwise, we might have had to end Biotech Hangout early this week. I'll also just mention that there was phase 3 data with mezigdomide in multiple myeloma. This is from BMS. This is extending their strong multiple myeloma franchise that they acquired from Celgene. Just briefly, in a phase 3 trial, adding mezigdomide help keep cancer at bay for roughly 10 months longer than the standard treatment of carfilzomib and dexamethasone alone. The study was conducted in relapse or refractory multiple myeloma patients. And in addition, the treatment led to a higher response rate of 80.2% compared to 53.4% with the standard treatment alone. So again, kind of a follow-on to Revlimid and Pomalyst for the BMS multiple myeloma franchise. Brian, let's go to you. I think you had a Biohaven R&D day you covered, and then you can then speak to Dyne as well.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to comment on the mesodomide side of things too. I covered Celgene back in the day. I actually have the protein structure in a little deal toy that they gave out probably a decade ago. So, I think it's notable they didn't have another IMiD in that they were comparing it to. So I just wonder, right? I mean, something like a lenalidomide or a pomalidomide plus carfilzomib and Dex would really be sort of the second line standard of care. So I'd wonder how that would fare versus mesodomide, because like Pomalyst and Revlimid have obviously shown good results as well in the indication. Maybe moving on, Biohaven. Yeah, there's like a hotly debated name, one of the most hotly debated names that I cover on the street. It's a company with a very, very big pipeline. Sometimes that is a bit of their downfall because they do spend a lot of capital. So one of the things that I hear criticism from investors is the dilution. But they have a number of things that they updated on. I thought were all interesting. People really focus on sort of their KV7 channel opener, which is in phase 3 for focal onset seizure. They've provided some interesting update from the open label extensions from their phase 3 studies. We're going to see the full phase 3 data later this year. Everyone's really looking to compare it to azotacolner, which is a program, also KV7, that is from Xenon, and they had really great phase 3 data earlier this year. So, there's really kind of like this head-to-head competition to show who could put up the better data sets. Here, I would say, we felt like it was a little bit of a positive incremental update just in terms of producing some data that people haven't seen before in terms of some of the reductions in seizure frequency. The obesity side of the story, they have a drug called taldefgrapop alpha, which is a myostatin antibody. Kind of one of the big debates in the obesity space is because you lose so much weight, a lot of that weight on GLP-1s is actually muscle mass. Myostatin targeted therapies have been shown to, in the case of an Atlas Venture company that got bought by Lilly, their drug bimagrumab, they've shown about 10% weight loss as a monotherapy. And what it really does in combinations with semaglutide versus data they presented last year is it changes sort of the body composition. So patients are losing weight, but they're primarily losing just fat weight, and they're maintaining or even increasing muscle mass. There's this big concern if everyone's going to lose 40% of their weight and it's all half muscle, half fat. Particularly for patients who wind up getting that weight back, they usually gain it all weight, and there's concerns that it's going to lead to significant problems as people will take much longer to rebuild muscle. Biohaven's going to have phase 2 data, and one of the knocks on bimagrumab that had a pretty hairy tolerability profile in that Lilly data, and doesn't seem like it's moving forward. So if they could kind of replicate the bimagrumab data in combination with semaglutide, ultimately, I think that becomes a really important piece of the puzzle for treating obesity. But the thing that I care the most about at Biohaven is I think they have this molecular degrader and trap program that utilizes receptor hepatocytes to really turn over extracellular proteins really quickly. They showed some very interesting IgAN data, IgA nephropathy, which is a pathogenic autoantibodies targeting the kidney, leads to very significant morbidity and mortality. There's a lot of patients out there who will ultimately go on to progressive kidney failure as a result of IgAN. This really targets the exact underlying pathogen, which is Gd-IgA1. They showed very good proteinuria reduction data, very good hematuria resolution data. And I think, there's a number of companies that are involved in this space targeting broad B cells and lowering sort of all immunoglobulins. And we have a launch in IgAN from Otsuka and Vertex and Vera have submitted applications for more B-cell targeted therapies. There's a number of B-cell targeted therapies, but I think this is really like a very, very targeted, specific therapy that it doesn't really suppress the immune system. I think it's really interesting, and they're planning to start a pivotal program in the next couple of weeks here. So I thought that was an interesting update. Maybe moving on to, well, I'll mention the Dyne thing, but I think there's a broad,
Yep.
I've gotten a lot of questions on FDA.
Oh, right.
All
Yeah.
the time, really. And I think, one of the Biohaven has a piece of this, Dyne has a piece of this, but there's a number of things. But, with the turnover of sort of this most recent guard at FDA of Marty Makary, Vinay Prasad, Tracy Beth Hogue, sort of all of these people who were viewed by industry as maybe kind of talking out of both sides of their mouths in terms of having like the flexibility that the GOP wants, but maybe this level of rigor that is more characteristic of MAHA, certainly in sort of pharmaceutical products.
Yep.
And, there's been a lot of like CRLs, whether they're fair or not, we could debate those, but, there are a lot of places where, sort of Makary was saying, oh, we're going to be super flexible and like, we're going to prove anything, even on like theoretical mechanism. But the reality was that, there were a number of CRLs. And, with him gone, the interim FDA commissioner, is actually he's been at the agency for a little bit. Kyle Diamantis, he was actually under Scott Gottlieb, I think, previously. He's evidently good friends with Trump. We're hearing kind of nice-ish things about him. I think very reserved.
Yep.
I mean, I think it's that he faces this is a really tough job, right? There's a lot of conflict
Yep.
between GOP and MAHA in sort of the what they want the FDA to do, and he's going to have to work in that dynamic. But what we're really seeing is that there's been a lot of turnaround in terms of these companies that were sort of pushed aside, at least getting a second chance. So, right, just this morning we have Replimune up substantially on
Yeah.
announcing an
Yeah.
agreement to resubmit the BLA for their melanoma therapy. Earlier this week, Outlook announced that they are resubmitting their application for bevacizumab in ophthalmology. This is interesting because in their press release, they're basically like, the FDA agreed that we have demonstrated substantial evidence of effectiveness, and it's going to be a class 1 submission. So, if all of that's true, it's almost like the FDA is guaranteeing an approval if manufacturing is okay. Dyne has announced that they submitted their BLA. This is on time. This is not necessarily a surprise, but covering Dyne, there's a lot of debate, and Chris, you kind of know this. There's a lot of debate as to what the FDA is going to do with sort of next generation exon skippers, because you sort of have this precedent that was started with eteplirsen, that if you show dystrophin expression with an exon skipper, then that's an approvable drug. Dyne's drug certainly does more, I think, in every measure. It shows more production of dystrophin than any of sort of the naked PMOs have. So it has better data there. So just on precedent, you would think this would be a layup, but obviously it's been super controversial. I'm sure like if Vinay Prasad was still there, I mean, he's kind of said some pretty mean things about your ex-company.
Yeah.
So,
well, and the risk profile would have gone up if he was still there for sure.
For sure.
For approval.
So yeah,
no, that's
a lot of these.
Yeah, Brian, that's a great overview. And look, it's the hard part is that I don't know that we really were if we were seeing the full potential fruits of the reforms of Makary, and there was this kind of schizophrenic kind of perspective. But let's hope that this is a harbinger of more positive, right, and predictability, most importantly, of the FDA. But that's great wrap. So we're at the hour. Just want to say thanks to our co-hosts, Brian and Greg. Thanks for Jason, who signed off earlier as a special guest. And thank you all for tuning into this episode of Biotech Hangout.